Everyone knows how Marilyn Monroe's story ended, but nobody knows about the secret midnight phone call and the 12-word warning that nearly changed everything just days before. If you think you knew the real Marilyn, you haven't heard the heartbreaking confession Judy Garland whispered to her at 3 o'clock in the morning. The world knew her as the girl in the white dress, the vision of gold and laughter who seemed to belong to everyone and no one. But in the dim light of that bedroom, she was only Norma Jeane, a woman who had spent 36 years looking for a home that didn't exist. She had been the most photographed woman in the world, yet she felt like a ghost trapped in a celluloid frame. Her breathing was shallow, the air heavy with Chanel No. 5, and the lingering ache of a heart broken by men who loved the image but feared the person. When she finally lifted the receiver, she heard a voice like sandpaper and silk, a voice that carried the weight of 1,000 spotlights and just as many tears. While the rest of Hollywood slept, two titans of the silver screen were about to strip away the glamour to reveal the scars beneath. It was Judy. There was no need for last names. There was only one Judy who could make the air feel this electric. Judy Garland was 4,000 miles away, but through the static of the long-distance line, she sounded as if she were sitting right there on the mattress. For a long moment, neither woman spoke. They simply listened to each other breathe, two icons of an era slowly devouring them both. Marilyn felt a tear prick her eye, not because she was sad, but because, for the first time in weeks, she wasn't alone. Judy had been the little girl who found the end of the rainbow only to find it was made of painted plywood and empty promises. Marilyn was the orphan who had climbed the highest peak in Hollywood only to find the air too thin to breathe. They were two sides of the same tragic coin, and on this night, the masquerade was over. Marilyn asked how Judy knew to call at this exact moment, as if the phone were a psychic bridge between wandering souls. Judy's laugh was short and brittle, the sound of someone who had looked into the abyss and decided to find the humor in it. She told Marilyn that she felt a sudden chill, a coldness that usually meant a sister was out in the storm without a coat. As the two women settled into the quiet intimacy of the call, the walls of the house seemed to lean in, eager to catch the secrets of two legends tired of being legendary. The conversation was no longer between movie stars, but between two souls who recognized the same flickering light in each other. "They don't see us, do they, Norma Jeane?" The question from Judy Garland drifted through the line like a leaf caught in an autumn wind, carrying a weight that made Marilyn's heart skip a beat. It was a question that stripped away the diamonds, the fur coats, and the frantic applause, leaving only two frightened children hiding in the bodies of grown women. Marilyn adjusted her pillows, her eyes fixed on a photograph of herself on the vanity, a picture where her smile looked bright enough to light up Los Angeles, yet she couldn't remember the last time she felt that joy. She told Judy that sometimes she felt like a store window mannequin, beautiful to look at but hollow inside, waiting for someone to notice that the lights were on but nobody was home. Judy sighed, a sound of profound recognition that spanned the miles. She reminded Marilyn of that chaotic studio party years ago, a night of expensive champagne and men in tuxedos who looked at them like prized thoroughbreds rather than human beings. They had both retreated to a dark coat room, sitting on the floor among heavy wool overcoats and silk wraps, sharing a single plate of hors d'oeuvres and talking just to hear a kind voice. In that moment of memory, the years melted away, and they weren't the highest-paid actresses in the world. They were just two girls raised by the cold, flickering light of a projector screen. Judy spoke of the days when the studio heads gave her substances to stay awake and substances to go to sleep, treating her like a machine that needed oiling rather than a girl who needed a hug. Marilyn whispered about the foster homes and the lockers where she used to hide, realizing that Hollywood was just a larger locker with more expensive locks. They had both been molded by the same cruel hands, sculpted into fantasies to satisfy a world hungry for beauty but indifferent to the pain required to produce it. Judy confessed that she often looked at the yellow brick road and saw only the cracks in the pavement, the places where she had stumbled while the cameras were rolling. They spoke of the loneliness that comes when you are surrounded by people who only want a piece of your magic. Marilyn admitted that she had spent her life trying to be Marilyn so that nobody would ever hurt Norma Jeane again, only to realize that the mask had become so heavy she could no longer hold her head up. Judy's voice grew soft as she told Marilyn that they were sisters in a way that blood never defined. They were sisters of the spotlight, bound together by the scars the world refused to see. It was a bond forged in the fires of fame, a secret understanding that while the world loved their voices and their faces, they were the only ones who truly loved the weary spirits underneath the glitter. As the clock ticked toward morning light, the two women realized they were sharing the very air they breathed. In the velvet silence of that connection, a new atmosphere settled between them, one that felt like a sacred vow. Judy's voice took on a crystalline clarity, stripping away the static until it felt as though she were leaning in to whisper directly into Marilyn's soul. She suggested that they stop playing the roles the world had written for them, just for this one night, and enter into a pact that no studio lawyer could ever touch. Marilyn felt a shiver run down her spine as she clutched the receiver, her knuckles turning white in the moonlight. She asked what kind of pact they could possibly make when they owned so little of their own lives. Judy replied that they could promise to tell the truth, the raw kind, because the world was already drowning in the beautiful lies they were paid to tell. It was a terrifying proposition for a woman who had spent a lifetime constructing a fortress of glamour to hide the girl who felt unwanted. But as she looked at the shadows on her bedroom wall, she realized the fortress had become a prison. She agreed, whispering her consent like a prayer, feeling the sudden lightness that comes when a heavy burden is finally shared. With the pact sealed, the floodgates began to open. Marilyn confessed her deepest fear that as she approached her 36th birthday, she was becoming an antique in a town that only worshipped the new. She spoke of the terrifying quiet that followed a day on the set, the way the silence felt like a weight pressing against her chest. She admitted she felt like a beautiful vase everyone wanted to put on their mantle, but no one wanted to hold when it was cracked. Judy listened with a heavy heart, recognizing every word as if it were a verse from her own life song. She told Marilyn that the exhaustion was the worst part, a tiredness that went so deep that even 1,000 years of sleep couldn't fix it. They talked about the vultures who circled their lives, the people who only called when they needed a favor, and the realization that they had become commodities instead of human beings. This was the secret pact of the misunderstood, a commitment to be the mirror for one another the world refused to provide. They promised that no matter how loud the music got or how bright the flashes became, they would always remember the sound of each other's true voices. It was a lifeline thrown across a vast ocean, and for the first time, the water didn't feel quite so cold. Marilyn felt a sense of peace beginning to bloom, a soft warmth that had been missing for years. But as the honesty continued to flow, the conversation took a turn toward a shadow that neither of them had ever dared to name out loud. Judy took a shaky breath, preparing to reveal a secret that would shake the very foundation of their shared world. This wasn't just a confession of sadness. It was a warning from a woman who had already seen the end of the yellow brick road and found it covered in the dust of broken spirits. If this story is touching your heart, please hit that subscribe button to join our community of friends who remember the true legends of Hollywood. Judy's voice dipped into a low register, a sound so heavy with sorrow that it seemed to vibrate through the plastic receiver. She confessed that for years, she had been searching for the road back to her true self, only to realize the studio had paved over every path. It was the sound of a woman who had run out of places to hide, admitting that the greatest performance of her life was the one where she pretended to be happy. She told Marilyn about a night at the Palace Theater, a night when the standing ovation lasted for 10 minutes and the roses piled so high she could barely see the front row. To the world, it was the ultimate triumph of a legend. But Judy whispered that as she stood in that golden light, she felt like a hollow shell. She looked at the thousands of faces and realized with a crushing blow that they didn't love her. They loved the idea of her, the little girl from Kansas who never grew up. She confessed that she had spent her life trying to give the audience every ounce of her spirit until there was nothing left for her children or herself. She felt like a ghost haunting her own dressing room, a woman who had lost her life to a character the public refused to let pass away. It was a heartbreaking admission that the rainbow everyone sang about was nothing more than a neon sign designed to sell tickets. The silence that followed was thick with the shared understanding of two women used as fuel for the Hollywood dream machine. Judy admitted her greatest sorrow wasn't the missed opportunities, but the fact that she had forgotten what her own natural voice sounded like when she wasn't trying to reach the back of the balcony. She spoke of the loneliness of being the world's greatest entertainer while sitting in a hotel room with only a bottle of pills and a cold television. She told Marilyn she was tired of being a miracle for everyone else while she felt like a disaster in private. It was a confession that stripped away the last layers of glamour, revealing a soul asking for permission to be weary. Marilyn listened, her own tears falling onto her nightgown, realizing that Judy was describing the very future she feared for herself. The woman who taught the world to dream was now admitting her own dreams had been replaced by a never-ending cycle of performance. Judy's voice broke as she whispered that she just wanted to be a mother and a friend, but the world wouldn't let her be anything other than a monument. As Judy's confession hung in the air, the weight of the truth seemed to change the temperature of the room. Marilyn knew she had to respond, but how could she offer comfort to a woman describing the very trap closing around her own heart? Marilyn slowly stood, the long telephone cord trailing like an umbilical cord, connecting her to the only source of warmth left. She walked toward the ornate vanity mirror that had seen every transformation, every coat of crimson lipstick, and every tear. As she caught her reflection in the moonlight, she did not see a movie star. She saw a stranger with wide, frightened eyes, wearing a mask that had grown too tight. She whispered into the receiver that she finally understood the cost of the miracle they performed for the public. She told Judy that Marilyn had started as a protective shield designed to keep the world from hurting the little girl who had never known her father. But over the years, the shield had become a cage, and the world had fallen so deeply in love with the cage that they had forgotten there was a living woman trapped inside. Marilyn confessed that she sometimes practiced the tilt of her head and the lilt of her voice until she no longer remembered how Norma Jeane actually sounded. She was the world's greatest fantasy, a woman that every man wanted, yet she felt like a hollow statue in a park, cold and crumbling from within. The pain in her voice was palpable as she described the sensation of being invisible while standing in a spotlight. She spoke of the directors who shouted at her, never realizing her mind was too full of her own loneliness to make room for their scripts. She told Judy about the crushing weight of being a symbol, a word that felt like a heavy stone tied around her neck. People would approach her on the street and look right through her, seeing only the blonde hair, never noticing the exhaustion in her eyes or the way her hands shook when she wasn't being photographed. She was a goddess to millions, but in the quiet hours of the night, she was just a woman who wanted someone to ask what she thought about the books she read. Judy's voice came through the line, soft and steady, telling her she was a miracle of resilience. But Marilyn shook her head and admitted that the burden of being Marilyn was finally breaking her spirit. She felt as though she were being pulled apart by 1,000 hands, each demanding a piece of her light until there was nothing left but shadows. It was a heartbreaking realization that the very thing that had saved her from foster homes was now taking her spirit away. In the silence, the two women stood on the precipice of their own history, looking at the wreckage of their public lives. Just when the sadness seemed too much, Judy remembered a small, tangible piece of hope she had been carrying for a long time. Have you ever felt like you had to wear a mask? Tell us your story in the comments below. Judy's voice softened into a warm embrace that seemed to wrap around Marilyn. She told Marilyn to go to the antique desk in the corner of her bedroom, the one with the silver drawer pulls. Judy whispered that she knew Marilyn still had it, a scrap of paper tucked away like a pressed flower in a forgotten book. It was a message sent when the Nevada sun was beating down on the set of The Misfits, and Marilyn felt her world was coming apart. Marilyn's fingers trembled as she pulled open the drawer, the scent of cedar and lavender wafting into the room. She found it at the back, beneath dried rose petals and a telegram from an old friend. It was a simple piece of hotel stationery, yellowed at the edges but carrying the strength of the woman who had written it. As she smoothed the creases, the moonlight caught the ink, and the words seemed to leap off the page. Judy had sent it when the headlines were at their cruelest, when the world was mocking Marilyn for her vulnerability. It was a 12-word lifeline that had once kept her from sinking. Marilyn read the words aloud, her voice catching on the syllables. You are the only light bright enough to see through my own darkness." The simplicity of the statement was staggering, a confession of mutual dependence that bypassed all the glitter. Judy explained that when she wrote those words, she wasn't writing to a movie star. She was writing to the only person who could look at her and see the little girl still afraid of the dark. She reminded Marilyn that their value didn't come from box office receipts, but from the way they could pull one another back from the abyss. This note was a testament that even in a town of artificiality, they had found something real. The emotional weight of the note seemed to fill the room, pushing back the shadows of the Brentwood house. Marilyn realized that while millions claimed to love her, Judy was the only one who actually knew what that love cost. The 12 words were a reminder that she wasn't just a commodity to be discarded. She was a beacon of hope for another soul navigating treacherous waters. For a brief moment, the exhaustion and fear vanished, replaced by a profound sense of purpose. They were two lighthouse keepers in a storm, signaling to each other that they were still standing and still capable of love. Marilyn pressed the paper against her heart, feeling the warmth seep into her bones. The connection was no longer just a call, it was a bridge of light spanning the distance. But as the warmth settled, Judy's tone shifted into something urgent and desperate. She knew the clock was ticking, not just for the night, but for the future of the woman on the other end. If this story is touching your soul, please share it with a friend who has been your light. The warmth of the memory was suddenly pierced by a sharp intake of breath, as if Judy were physically reaching through the miles to grab Marilyn by the shoulders. The gentle tone vanished, replaced by an intensity that made the hair on Marilyn's arms stand up. Judy knew the rhythms of Hollywood better than anyone, and she could hear the gears of the great machine grinding closer, ready to turn another beautiful soul into dust. She pleaded with Marilyn to listen, her voice cracking with sincerity as she told her she had to get out of that house and away from that city before it was too late. Judy spoke of the vultures in expensive suits who paced the hallways, the men who saw a woman's tears only as a delay in production and her exhaustion as weakness. "Norma Jeane," she whispered, "they will use your light to guide their way, and then they will leave you in the dark when your wick burns out." She told Marilyn she was currently standing in a burning building, but she had become so used to the heat she couldn't smell the smoke. Judy had seen it happen to so many others, the slow fading away of the spirit until there was nothing left but a name on a marquee. She begged her friend to pack a suitcase, to leave the jewelry behind, and to catch the first flight to New York where the air was colder but the people were more human. Marilyn stood paralyzed, the shadows of the eucalyptus trees swaying like dark spirits against her window. She tried to argue that she had contracts to fulfill and promises to keep, but Judy cut her off with a sob that sounded like a physical blow. Judy told her the industry would never be satisfied until it had taken everything, until every drop of magic had been bottled and sold, leaving her a hollow shell with no one to hold her hand when the lights finally went out. She confessed she stayed awake, fearing she would pick up the paper and see Marilyn's face in black and white, framed by a headline that would break the world's heart. It was a chilling foreshadowing of the early August morning, only days away, a warning from one survivor to another, approaching the end. The desperation in Judy's voice was a cry for Marilyn to save herself, because Judy wasn't sure if she could save herself. She promised that if Marilyn left, they could find a small place in the country, away from the flashbulbs, where they could just be Norma Jeane and Frances again. She spoke of a life where they weren't property or symbols, and where they could finally sleep without the fear of never waking up. It was a plea for the preservation of her life, a final, frantic attempt to pull a sister back from the brink of a darkness that had already claimed so many. As the echoes of Judy's warning faded, the weight of the decision settled onto Marilyn's shoulders like lead. For a moment, the two women allowed themselves to look past the tragedy, venturing into a dream of a world that would never be. For 10 minutes, the heavy atmosphere of the Hollywood Hills seemed to evaporate, replaced by the scent of wild clover and fresh rain. The fear and the warnings were set aside, and the two women began to weave a tapestry of a life that existed only in the quiet corners of their hearts. They stopped being icons and became architects of a dream, building a world where the only audience was the morning sun and the only reviews were written in the swaying of the trees. Marilyn closed her eyes, leaning her head against the cool window pane as she described a small white house far away from the smog of Los Angeles. She spoke of a place where they would wake up to the sound of birds and the smell of coffee brewing in a kitchen that actually felt like home. There would be no scripts to memorize and no need to worry if her smile was bright enough for the cameras. She imagined them hanging laundry on a long line in the backyard, the white sheets snapping in the wind like the sails of a ship carrying them away. Judy added to the vision with a soft laugh, imagining a garden where they would grow tomatoes and sunflowers, getting their hands stained with honest dirt instead of the cold grease paint of the studio. In this shared fantasy, they were just two neighbors who looked out for one another, two women who had finally outrun the shadows of their own fame. Judy talked about how they would walk down to a local diner where nobody knew their names, where they could sit in a booth for hours and talk about books without anyone interrupting for an autograph. They wouldn't be Marilyn or Judy anymore. They would be the women they were meant to be before the world got its hands on them. They spoke of long, lazy afternoons spent reading poetry aloud and evenings where they would watch the sunset without feeling the pressure to perform for the light. It was a beautiful picture of peace, a sanctuary built of words and wishes that offered a brief respite from the reality of their isolation. For the first time in years, the tension in Marilyn's shoulders melted away, replaced by a warmth that felt like a genuine hug. They weren't fighting for survival, they were simply two friends enjoying the company of their own shared imagination. It was a moment of pure hope, a glimpse into a reality where their value wasn't measured in ticket sales, but in the quiet contentment of a life well lived. They allowed themselves to believe, if only for a few heartbeats, that the yellow brick road could actually lead to a place where the heart didn't have to break to be seen. As the vision of the White House faded back into the shadows, a profound silence settled between them. The dream had given them the strength to face the finality of the night, but both knew the morning was bringing a goodbye they weren't ready to say. The first rays of the California sun began to bleed through the cracks in the heavy velvet curtains, turning the shadows into a pale gray. The magic of the midnight hour was retreating, chased away by the reality of a world already waking up and preparing to demand its pound of flesh from the two women on the line. Marilyn watched the dust motes dancing in the light, realizing the bridge they had built through the darkness was about to dissolve into the morning air. The line went quiet for a long minute, a silence that wasn't empty, but filled with everything they had finally dared to say. Marilyn could hear a bird chirping outside her window, a sound that felt strangely cruel after the intimacy of their secrets. She gripped the receiver one last time, wishing she could wind the cord around her heart to keep the connection from snapping. She thanked Judy for calling, her voice a soft thing that seemed to catch on the lump in her throat. She told her that for the first time in years, she felt as though she actually existed, not as a picture in a magazine, but as a person worthy of being heard. Judy's voice was weary, sounding as though she had traveled 1,000 miles since the sun went down, but there was a fierce tenderness in her tone that Marilyn would never forget. She told Marilyn that she was more than enough, just as she was, without the makeup, the light, and the applause. She made Marilyn promise to remember the 12-word note and the White House with the laundry on the line whenever the world tried to tell her she was nothing more than a fantasy. Judy whispered that they were the only ones who knew the true cost of the rainbow, and that made them guardians of each other's souls. The air in the room felt thick with the weight of an ending neither of them wanted to name, a finality deeper than just hanging up the phone. When the final "I love you" was spoken, it wasn't the practiced line of a movie script. It was a simple, ragged whisper from one tired woman to another, a promise of a love that didn't ask for anything in return. Marilyn listened as the line finally clicked shut, the dial tone humming a low, lonely note that filled the room like a morning song. She slowly lowered the receiver back into its cradle, feeling a sudden, sharp coldness in her palm where the warmth of the plastic had been. She stood there in the rising light, a woman alone in a house that felt far too quiet, holding on to the echo of Judy's voice as if it were the only thing keeping her from the end. The call was over, and the silence that followed was the loudest thing Marilyn had ever heard. She had no way of knowing this would be the final time they would ever speak, or that within days the world would be changed forever by a headline that Judy had desperately tried to rewrite. Years later, a quiet reporter asked Judy Garland if she truly believed anyone had ever really known the woman called Marilyn. Judy leaned back, a distant look entering her eyes, and whispered that she was the only one who truly understood that Marilyn wasn't saying hello during those final months. She was slowly saying goodbye. It was a haunting admission that the bridge of light built during that 3 o'clock call had been the final anchor holding a drifting soul to the shore. We often ask what happened in those final days in Brentwood, but the real story isn't in the rumors, it's in the silence that followed this phone call. The story of that midnight conversation remained a hidden treasure for decades, a secret tucked away in the hearts of those who knew the heavy price of fame. When the news finally broke on that tragic August morning in 1962, the world wept for a blonde bombshell they felt they owned, but Judy wept for a sister she had finally found and lost to the silence. She refused to attend the public services, choosing instead to sit alone in a darkened room, clutching a small scrap of stationery and humming a melody that only 2 people in the world ever truly understood. She knew that Marilyn had finally found her way to that white house with the wraparound porch, the one where the laundry snapped in the wind and the telephone never rang. The legacy of their bond wasn't found in the movies they left behind, but in the profound reminder that even the brightest stars are often the loneliest. They taught us that behind every mask of glamour and every shield of success, there is a human being simply longing to be seen for who they are when the makeup is washed away. In the end, Marilyn and Judy were 2 sides of the same beautiful, broken mirror, reflecting a world too eager to watch them shine and too slow to notice when they were flickering out. The 12-word note was found among Judy's private things long after she had also departed this world, a final testament to a friendship that transcended the cruel machinery of Hollywood. It served as a reminder to every person who has ever felt invisible that your worth is not measured by how many people know your name, but by the hands you hold when the darkness feels too heavy to carry alone. We look back at their lives now and see more than just icons. We see 2 brave women who managed to turn the static of a lonely world into a symphony of pure love. They were the 2 little girls who found each other in the coat room of history and decided that they didn't need the rainbow as long as they had the truth. Sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones that never made the headlines, and the deepest bonds are the ones forged in the quietest hours of the night. If this journey into the secret friendship between Marilyn and Judy touched your heart, please hit that like button to help us share their light with others. To ensure you never miss another untold chapter from the lives of Hollywood's most beloved legends, subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell. Thank you for being part of our community and for remembering that behind every icon, there is a soul simply hoping to be seen.